It's Wednesday, February 3rd, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Ernest Perry and Tim Vos. On our program this week, a look at the media's coverage of the water contamination crisis in Flint, Michigan. An Ohio judge sanctions an attorney for tipping off the media to a lawsuit, claiming it tainted the trial. What kind of precedent might that set? And we're going to talk about a Connecticut newsroom shutting down, but its staff will still be putting out a paper. We'll tell you how. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but let's start with the nation's political focus, shifting from Iowa to New Hampshire. From Iowa Monday night, we watched the caucuses. It's a process unknown to many, especially in primary states like we have here in Missouri. We'll get to the actual coverage of some of those in a moment, but first I want to start by asking, did you watch any of the actual caucuses themselves?
No, didn't watch the actual. Well, I'll take that back. I watched a little bit of it whenever the networks, the cable networks would jump in and cut into them and that sort of thing, but not one full caucus. It was mainly just a run-in commentary of the usual suspects.
Yeah, I peeked in on some of the network coverage as well, but this was my life, 20 years ago or thereabouts, covering the Iowa caucuses, living in Iowa, working as a journalist there. I'm pretty familiar with how the caucuses work.
Well, and I actually, after getting a little bit tired of listening to the tap dancing that was going on some of the networks, I started flipping through, and as I'm apt to do during something like the State of the Union or on election night, I went straight to C-SPAN, and C-SPAN and C-SPAN 2 had set up cameras, one at a Republican caucus, one at a Democratic caucus, and basically showed them beginning to end and gave that peek into what is this whole thing? Because it's not like anything we're used to doing here in Missouri where you walk in and you vote like any other election. And it's a fascinating process if you're not familiar with it, and it also provided a nice relief, frankly, from watching the talking heads tap dancing, waiting for something to happen.
Yeah. Well, it can be very democratic in the sense where you're getting together with your neighbors, you're talking about the issues, you're talking about why you support a candidate or not.
Especially on the Democratic side, where there is a whole lot of actual, like, you vote with your body. So there's a whole lot of movement from one side of the room to another until you reach the number of delegates needed for your precinct, your polling place, your caucus site to be able to move forward.
But even in the Republican caucus, there are people talking about why they're supporting the candidates that they do. So that's the Democratic part about it. But the turnout is enormously low because it takes an evening when a lot of people don't have the time for it, and it's also
the weather's bad,
or the weather's bad. But it can be sort of awkward to bring politics to your neighbors when you've maybe avoided politics with your neighbors. So,
I actually saw an interesting statistic. I'm sorry to cut you off. Saw an interesting statistic. Somebody tried to bring some context to the conversation and pointed out that I believe it was Ted Cruz had something in the area of 59,000 votes, but compared that to the football stadium in Dallas that holds 80,000 people.
Right. And that's one of the things that makes Iowa unique in the fact that in these caucuses, the turnout is so low, but we give it in the media so much attention because it's
spent the last year
first
talking
one.
about it.
Exactly. And as we talked about on the program last week, Iowa is not representative of the rest of the country when it comes to the demographics of the state population and the demographic of those who show up for the caucuses. So for all the, I guess, the hype we give it and the publicity we give it, when the whole process is done, Iowa is just a small, very small cog in the whole nominating process.
Especially because it seems we see in presidential election after presidential election, the person who wins in Iowa is not likely to necessarily.
Then there's Barack Obama, and
okay.
But I mean, I think
But wasn't it Mike Huckabee 4 years ago?
Iowa's role has been, I think, to put people on a stage.
Okay.
And where they go from there is another matter. Mike Huckabee just went to Fox News, so it got him something.
Well, so there was another caucus day headline that may be worth talking about. The awkward exchange between Today Show host Savannah Guthrie and Matt Lauer and Sarah Palin. She was there on Monday morning to throw additional support for Donald Trump. Take a listen to where their whole conversation fell apart.
I want to ask you about something you mentioned on the campaign trail, which is the arrest of your son track. And you talked about it, and then you mentioned PTSD. And you said that President Obama may be to blame for some of the PTSD that's out there.
That.
Well, let's take it piece by piece. What exactly did you mean?
Let's start piece by piece by, you guys brought me here to talk about Iowa politics and the caucus tonight, not to talk about my kids. And that was a promise. But as things go in the world of media, you guys don't always keep your promises, evidently. I never blamed President Obama. What I have blamed President Obama in doing, though, is this level of disrespect for the United States military that is made manifest in gutting budgets, in not trying to beef it up and let our military do the job that they are trained to do.
She went on following that train of thought a while longer, and then Lauer threw in this follow-up.
Do you regret the comment, though, Governor Palin, on that day of the endorsement?
What did I say that is offensive?
That you seem to lay it at the feet of the president.
I don't regret any comment that I made because I didn't lay PTSD at the foot of the president. I did say, though, that there is, and suggested very adamantly, that there is much more that our commander-in-chief can do to prove that he respects our troops and will let them do their job. But no, if you guys have a specific quote, it allows the media to be more credible if you guys will tell me exactly what you're talking about, and then I can address that.
In terms of credibility, I just want to make sure there were no specific promises made about content of the interview, only that this would be your first interview since you endorsed Donald Trump.
Well, I was told that this interview is about the caucus tonight in Iowa, and right on who will it be to put America back on the right track and restore constitutional government that we are lacking today and that we so need. And I said, right on, let me go talk about that. Sure.
If you haven't yet heard what they're referring to, we've linked to those comments on our links blog. I have a couple of reasons for bringing this up. First, in your opinion, what she said at that Trump endorsement rally, do you feel like it was interpreted correctly? Did she put Track's PTSD, his behavior, on the president?
I think she put a lot on the president. I mean, one of the things I was at least a little bit happy to see from Sarah Palin is her actually saying President Obama, where she usually just says Obama or she says the president, but she never links the two. But, you know, she did talk about that, and she's talked about in trying to deflect some of the criticism about her being on the road endorsing Trump. At the same time, her son is dealing with this very serious crisis going on back at home in terms of his assault on I think it's his girlfriend and that sort of thing. But overall, I think the problem that I have with the whole Sarah Palin showboating is, why is she even there? I kept, even when they were promoting it, I would turn to someone and I'd go like, why is the Today Show having Sarah Palin on? She's not running for office. All she did was endorse the guy. Why is she getting this much publicity? Because 4 days out, they were promoting that she was going to be on the show on Monday.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have a real strong opinion about this. With all due respect to Sarah Palin, she's not always completely clear in what she says. So I guess that allows for a certain level of deniability about what she did say during that particular address. But I certainly interpreted what she said initially as laying it at the feet of the president. So, it would have been nice if they could have run the tape right back to her at that point.
And then considered running it here, too, so that we would have it there to have that. And then I realized that would have meant we listened to about 4 minutes of Sarah Palin just to be able to set up this discussion, and didn't know if I wanted to do that. The other part that's really interesting to me to talk about this from a journalistic standpoint is this claim that she's making that there was a promise made to her that there wasn't going to be any discussion of her children, of this incident, of anything that has gone on recently with her daughter Bristol having another child, this idea of we're not going to be talking about my children. And I guess on some level, if I'm Sarah Palin, maybe I don't want to go out there and talk about my children, but Matt Lauer is saying there was never any type of a deal made in those lines. These children are legal adults. Is it fair game, or is it getting into that point of that shouldn't be on the table in the first place?
Well, I mean, to me, part of the problem here is that what Sarah Palin says is that I was promised that we would talk about Iowa, but what she didn't say was, and we wouldn't talk about anything else. And I think when being in politics as long as she has been, especially on this national stage,
she should be somewhat more shrewd than that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's being, I think she should have known that something about that incident was going to come up, because she's been asked these questions before, maybe not by the Today Show, but by other political reporters on the campaign trail as she's gone around with Donald Trump and campaigned for him.
Well, it's also clever how she switched to one of her favorite talking points, and she didn't talk about the media. It was, what was the term she used? Did she say mainstream media? The liberal media.
Yeah.
The liberal media accomplished this. And, that's always a popular, tune to whistle as well, particularly for her targeted audience, that you can lay something again at the feet of the liberal media. So,
well, the one thing that sort of bothered me about all of this was the fact that NBC and the Today Show promoted this, and I think the main reason they did this was to get a certain segment of the audience to begin to view the Today Show, because from what I've been able to tell, even from the point in which she endorsed Donald Trump up until this interview, she's really brought nothing to the table that we haven't seen before. So to bring her on is mainly just to bring Sarah Palin on and make this connection, I think, and this is just me, this connection between NBC, the Today Show, and maybe even to Saturday Night Live and Tina Fey. I mean, that's the only reason that I could think of,
so
at least in my mind.
It's promotion for NBC. That's what
I think it's promotion for NBC.
Wow.
Or perhaps the ability to generate some kind of extra content. If you get her to say something or do something, maybe it gives Tina Fey new material.
That's a possibility. I mean, that's true.
They're playing the long game in that case.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Yeah. But Amy, to come back to one of your other points between what's public and what's personal here, that line is really a pretty fine line. It's really hard to see sometimes. And the fact that Sarah Palin brought up her son's condition suggests that was a public issue.
She opened that door.
She opened the door.
It's also an arrest, which is a public record.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there are things about her children that would not be worth bringing up, or might even be in poor taste to bring up, or off topic. But I think her point that this was somehow going into a private realm, well, again, she's the one who raised this as an issue. So I'm finding that argument not the most convincing.
Okay, well, I want to, before we move on, kind of make a promise to the two of you, to Mike McKean and Abstentia, to our audience, that we still have a long time before the election in November. And we're not going to follow this horse race every single week after every single primary in every single state. When there's a media angle to talk about, we'll talk about it. But we're not going to break down every single primary vote. With all of the talk, though, about the primaries and Sarah Palin's comments and the Oscars and everything else we've talked about in these last few weeks, we've been remiss. We haven't talked at all about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and I want to fix that. I want to fix that right now. So by now, you know what's happened there. The people of Flint, Michigan have been drinking lead-contaminated water for the better part of the last 2 years. To date, 4 government officials have resigned, including one from the city, 2 from the Michigan Department of Environmental Equality, 1 from the Environmental Protection Agency. Governor Rick Snyder has apologized to citizens and promised to fix the problem, but people there are still relying on bottled water, much of it donated, in order to survive. 2 years is a long time when you're talking about access to clean and safe drinking water. There's been a lot of criticism and blame on the media that somehow this didn't come to light before a couple weeks ago. Yeah,
and I think it's justified. I mean, if viewers and listeners want to go to our links blog, we have some really good stories from various agencies about what media could have done better. But I think to me, what it boils down to is that we didn't have our eyes on the ball, and possibly because we didn't have enough eyes. We didn't have enough journalists. We don't cover local governmental entities as well as we should. And this is one of those cases in which public service that people depend on. I mean, just turning the faucet on and getting good, clean drinking water is crucial.
That's a fundamental for life. Let's go to the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, that's something you need for survival.
No, exactly. And the fact that was contaminated, and city officials and state officials and federal officials knew about it, but the media wasn't there to cover it. I mean, that is a lack of responsibility on our part as journalists.
So whose feet do you put that on? And maybe, Tim, I'll start with you on this. Margaret Sullivan, who is public editor for the New York Times, is not accepting any excuses and saying that her newspaper should have done a better job. Is the New York Times the paper that should have been front and center to fix the contaminated drinking water problem in Flint, Michigan?
Well, I'm guessing the way that you posed that question, the answer is no.
I don't know. I guess I would look to the local media on that one first, and maybe the New York Times then comes in. But I don't know.
But I think they have an outsized role.
Okay.
I mean, they're an important national media outlet, one that has the capability to do significant investigative journalism. And if they decide this is an important issue, a fundamental issue, then I think it gets everyone's attention. We know that on our own campus very well. When the national media starts paying attention, well, then we really need to take things seriously. Well, that would have been, I think, an important factor in Flint as well. When the national media descends on your city, okay, now you better behave.
Well, I think part of the issue here too is that when you look at Flint as a community, it doesn't have a lot of power. It doesn't have a lot of political power, and I think that in and of itself is also part of the problem in terms of the media, because we tend to follow the political power. And since Flint didn't have it, we weren't there, and I'm talking about the national media. So it is incumbent upon the local media to try to drive that story to the point where it becomes a national conversation. The fact that it took 2 years for that to happen and various FOIA requests and that sort of thing, I think is somewhat of a travesty. But to me, it goes back to the fact that local media the numbers are down in terms of the numbers of reporters, both in newspapers as well as the amount of coverage that you get from local television and radio. And I think that has an impact on it. But I also think that when people make decisions about going into the voting booth to vote people into office, and what they're going to do when people say, okay, we want tax cuts, or we want to have these services being looked at, that matters. And part of it is also on the state government and people in the state to say, hey, we need to spend more money on our infrastructure. And that's a story that doesn't get as much coverage on a local basis as it should.
Coming back to the national coverage, though, I think sometimes we say, or at least people smarter than me have said, that the role of the media is to see life steady and see it whole. That, we don't just jump at any and every little thing. And if we're able to keep things in perspective, then that allows us the ability to really emphasize a truly enormous problem and a sensational problem when the time comes. It's sensationalism if you make everything into a sensation. And you're not able to be the agenda setter in the national media in those circumstances. So, I think you have to have a situation in which you can say, now this is really a big issue. This time we mean it. Isn't going to work. I mean, it really needs that proportion, and it deserved a much more proportionate coverage than what it received.
Okay. open a newspaper or turn on a newscast anywhere in the country, and you're bound to find a story about someone suing someone else. And in every one of those cases, there's likely to be a personal injury attorney or a class action attorney trying to create outrage on behalf of their client. I'd venture to say a good 95% of those stories are the result of a press release or a daybook item in which the attorney announces a news conference and the media, looking for a quick and easy story to churn, shows up. Well, a judge in Ohio punished a Cleveland lawyer for tipping off a newspaper to a lawsuit claiming that a nanny school there had covered up reported sexual abuse. What are the particulars of this case? It's kind of complicated.
Well, I think part of the particulars is the fact that you had an attorney who was friends with a reporter for an alternative weekly newspaper, and he provided him with some documents, public documents, which the reporter could have gotten from anywhere, but he happened to get them from this attorney who was his friend, and he ran the story. Well, the judge saw that as some sort of a conflict that created an issue for this case, and he basically went after the attorney, and now we've got this situation where the attorney is having to appeal this case that the judge brought before him. So, I mean, it's to me, it's one of those things where you have some First Amendment issues here, because if a judge can basically tell an attorney or anyone, you can't turn over information to a reporter.
When there isn't a gag order in the case, where there isn't a reason for a gag order.
When there's not a reason, or to do it after the fact. Now, all of a sudden, you've got attorneys who are going to be afraid to even talk to reporters on cases that are vitally important for the public to know about.
Well, I think we've seen a pretty significant turn in recent years at a national level, even. And in certain cases at the local level, of trying to criminalize the collection of information for news. We've seen that with national and foreign policy issues and the like. So I really cannot fathom that this will stand up to scrutiny. I think this gets sent back, overturned somewhere down the road. I mean, they're trying to balance rights, fair trial, but this wasn't a very good balance.
Okay, well,
surprisingly enough, as a journalist, I would say that, but yeah.
So all three of us have spent considerable time working as journalists before we came here. Ernest, you working as a reporter for major daily newspapers. Tim working in radio. I worked in television news before moving on to the web staff at a newspaper. Regardless of where we worked, I'm guessing we all carry with us some classic newsroom experiences, classic newsroom memories. Well, imagine if those all went away because the newsroom ceased to exist. It happened Monday in Middletown, Connecticut. There's still a paper there, but all of its editorial employees are working remotely as a means to cut overhead. Does this sound like a reasonable production model to you? Tim, I'm going to start with you.
It might work for production, but it's not just getting out a product. It's the kind of product you put out, for one thing. So, I mean, I think this model maybe works for a certain kind of journalism, but there's also a kind of journalism that requires more collaboration, where you need to bounce ideas off of other people. You need to have, and again, that can happen in other settings perhaps as well. That's historically happened in the newsroom, and that's been one of the important roles that the newsroom has played, to be a sounding board before something gets to publication.
I think one of the other issues that's really important is mentorship. When you have younger reporters who are coming into a newsroom, they learn from the older reporters. So there's this sort of institutional knowledge and memory there that you can't replicate in a virtual environment.
Ours isn't a profession that can happen in a vacuum.
Right, exactly. And those interactions, I mean, if you're talking about older reporters or younger reporters or editors talking to reporters to make sure that they're all on the same page, the context part that we talk about a lot, sometimes a reporter can lose perspective on that context, and another reporter or someone else in the newsroom can sort of bring that in. When you don't have that kind of interaction, then you sort of lose that. But I do understand why some news operations are trying to go more more virtual. I think they're doing it for financial reasons in this operation, but I know in other places they're trying to do it in order for the reporters to spend more time out in the field, actually talking to sources and that sort of thing. But I still think you need to have that sort of interaction.
That home base.
Yes,
in that
yes.
way.
Well, I see both sides to what Ernest has said. I like the idea of journalists being oriented to the audience because in the past they've been oriented to each other.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that socialization of young reporters has a good side, but it also
it can perpetuate some
yes,
very negative
it can
things.
definitely perpetuate some things, and it. Warren Breed wrote a seminal piece back in the 1950s, Social Control in the Newsroom, and it's the socialization where you're working together, where you learn some habits, and not all of them are necessarily good.
So quickly before we go, when I first read about this, Ernest, I immediately thought of you. Every time you and I start to talk about TV, the very first thing you tell me is you don't have time to pick up one more show. Well, what would you do if the New York Times suggested it was binge-worthy? It's testing a new service journalism product, to use their words. The idea is that it will curate and push out its arts and culture content and have a recommendation engine that would work similarly to its free cooking site, NYT Food. I can see how something like this would work for food, for recipes, to always find something new. In the back of my mind, I keep thinking buzzworthy TV. I'm going to start watching stuff because other people are talking about it, not because the New York Times tells me to watch it.
Well, and that was the first thing I thought about was, wait a minute, how does the New York Times going to be able to tell me what to watch? I mean, is it playing around in my head? And I'm thinking, no, they can't be doing that. So it's got to be one of those things where you have a whole bunch of New York Times people sitting around saying, hey, we should put this up, and have people start binge watching this. Well, that may not fit with what other people may be viewing. I find this is going to be a lot more difficult for them to do than the food thing, which I actually enjoy.
Well, it seems to me Netflix does this already. And they do it better because they know the shows that I like and the shows that I watch. They know the frequency with which I watch them, so they know when I'm binging, which I don't binge a lot, but I do watch them fairly frequently, or I watch a series over 6 months or over 6 days. Well, sure. I think Netflix maybe has more data, and I'm not sure I want to trust an algorithm over the advice of seasoned journalists, but the algorithm is built on what I already do.
The algorithm is built on what you already do, or I'll be honest, I watched Making a Murderer because I saw that 3 or 4 or 5 of my Facebook friends start talking about watching Making a Murderer. And I have to think that this is one of those things where buzz builds up organically.
Right.
And that the New York Times maybe not going to be able to do that in the same way through this type of a recommendation engine.
Yeah, I think it's an audience thing here, and it's who is your audience, and sometimes I think they can.
Okay, maybe the New York Times' audience does watch its
maybe so.
binge TV
Not
by
sure.
doing that. Okay, well, we are just about out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics that we talked about today on our links blog. That's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. And these are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. KBIA's Pat Akers handled our audio, and C-Chan is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.